Dear viewers, dear panelists, dear colleagues, thank you for joining us in the seminar on Ischgl and so-called super spreader locations today. Ischgl, as the Ibiza of the Alps, is famous for parties and good skiing, and is more recently, since the outbreak of the pandemic, referred to as a center for COVID-19. With over 20,000 beds for tourists, Ischgl registers around 1 million overnight stays per season, with a weekly turnover of 150,000 tourists. This year, there will be no after-ski in Ischgl. The reasons are obvious. Ischgl is seen as ground zero from where the virus spread throughout Europe. Around 10,000 EU citizens were infected in Ischgl. At least 28 have died, according to ORF. Could we have seen it coming? Was Ischgl, with its parties and crowded bars, a breeding ground for the virus? And how then shall such scenarios be managed? This seminar is not about finding a scapegoat, but we want to better understand the role of such super spreader locations. After all, such locations have a strong impact on the propagation of COVID-19. How did Ischgl become such a significant accelerator? And how can such a scenario be prevented in the future? Together with researchers, journalists, and health officials, we will investigate what happened in Ischgl and try to get a better grip on such super spreaders. And we will discuss what lessons we can draw from Ischgl in order to better contain cross-border health threats in the future. I'm looking forward to the debate and give now the word to Claudia Gammon, my colleague of the Renew political group in the European Parliament. Claudia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Also, thank you very much for the nice introduction. You gave us a good view back into the history of Ischgl and what happened there. I want to thank all the viewers and, of course, Mr. Goerens' Bureau and Charlotte for organizing this event. For me, as an Austrian MEP, it has been, of course, shocking to see what had happened in Ischgl. But it is important for us to move forward and to avoid such mistakes happening again. It is important to see what actually happened and to learn from it. The question, what for me was most interesting is whether or not the communication between regional and national authorities was not working properly, or whether or not the competencies were not clear, or whether or not it was a combination of both that eventually caused this hotspot in Ischgl. The infected people were sent home to their countries, spreading the virus even further, and this led to the spread of the virus into 45 countries and 5 continents. I want to underline that this webinar is not about passing blame, but rather about preparing us better for what we have to do this winter and also in future pandemics, because there is no guarantee that this won't happen again at some point in our lives. The responsibilities in this case will be up to the authorities to clear up, but in the meantime, we have to ask ourselves, how can we improve the system that we work with? How can we better communicate between regional, national, and international health agencies? And one important question of course, for us in the European Parliament, how could we benefit, for example, from strengthening European agencies such as the ECDC in this regard? So this is about a very European question. How can we improve the cooperation between countries in such topics that have an obvious cross-border relevance? It is important that we prevent such super spreader events this winter season. I guess foregoing the usual après-ski is obviously a good idea, but the question is, will this be enough, and how can tourism actually work under such circumstances? We have to be prepared in order to have long-term strategies in place to prevent an Ischgl 2.0 from happening. I am looking forward to a very interesting discussion and discussing also some of the questions that have been raised just right now. And I wish everybody a very interesting start into the day, and hope that we will all be a lot smarter once this event is over. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I would say we start right away with our first panel, which is going to look at Ischgl and look at, well, what are the mechanisms behind such super spreaders, and also how do we come to have this definition and how does this work? So in the first step, we're going to look at what actually happened in Ischgl and why is Ischgl so famous now for the COVID-19 virus. Then in a second step, we will discuss what the consequences thereof of the events in Ischgl were, and also look at it from a scientific point of view. And then in a third step, we're going to look at one example, the example of Germany, to see, well, how did the virus spread from Ischgl to another country, in this case, a neighboring country. So joining us is Jakob Winter. He's a journalist at the news magazine Profil, and he's been investigating the spread of the virus in Ischgl from the beginning of the pandemic, and has been finding out quite a lot about the management of the virus by the authorities. Then there's Dorothee van Leer. She's a virologist working at the Innsbruck Medical University, and she's been conducting, amongst others, an antibody studies on the Ischgl residents to see, well, if and how many people have antibodies against COVID-19. And then in a third step, we're going to talk to Sonali Chowdhury, who's going to walk us through the study that she did with her colleagues on the spread of the virus from Ischgl to Germany. And I'd say we start right away with you, Jakob. And can you, you've been investigating this for months now. Can you just walk us a bit through what happened in Ischgl and give us an overview of the events in the ski resorts?
Ja, sehr gerne. Also zunächst möchte
Yes. First of all, I would like to thank you very much for the organization and for inviting me to this event. At our magazine, we also were subject to a lot of criticism, also by the local government in Tyrol, due to our critical reporting. And we also received a few reader comments that were very critical. And I always replied, if a pandemic was to occur again, then don't we want to ensure that crisis management works better? And I usually receive no further reply to this reaction. So it seems like this argument was successful, and that's why I'm also very pleased that the European Parliament wants to take a closer look at what happened in Ischgl in order to avoid such situations in the future. Allow me to give you a brief overview of what went wrong in Ischgl from my point of view. I would like to start by saying that my research has shown that, especially at the beginning, when there were the first warnings, we need to go back to the beginning of March. We are now at the beginning of March in Ischgl. And that's when the first warnings were expressed by our European partners. So that worked. There was a warning from Iceland on the 4th of March. And what's interesting is that the local authorities did not take these warnings particularly seriously. They were played down. In the official news, it was said, well, these people from Iceland that were infected in Ischgl probably got infected on their journey back. That was a good enough explanation. And I don't want to be a spoiler, but that really was an attempt to avoid contamination in Ischgl. But then, well, it was kind of, the truth wasn't accepted. And the tourists and the local population in Ischgl were informed too late about the dangers of this virus. So at first, the danger wasn't taken serious. The warnings of the European partners weren't taken serious. Secondly, one then had to accept that the virus was spreading in Ischgl after a barkeeper was tested positive. And when this positive test result was at hand, and when more and more positive tests surfaced, one finally reacted, but in my opinion, not strongly enough and not restrictively enough. Two examples, if you allow me to give you those. First of all, one noticed that these bars where parties take place with hundreds and thousands of people, well, these bars were closed down. But the local providers did not take these seriously. They simply did not really respect the lockdown. There was a regulation of the local authorities to close the bars, definitely. The bars had to remain closed. But they did not really adhere to these rules. They kept the bars open and continued to party. So first of all, warnings not taken seriously. Secondly, the regulations were implemented too late and not fully implemented and not respected. Thirdly, the local contact tracing did not really work. I called a German tourist who told me, Mr. Winter, you're the first Austrian to call me after months. He had gone to a holiday in Ischgl. On the 9th of March, he sent an email to Ischgl and said, I have been in Germany for a day. I've been tested positively. I was probably infected in Ischgl. And this information was passed on to the Ischgl police, but nothing happened at all. One didn't even call to ask what persons he might have been in contact with in order to conduct more people tracing. Third mistake. And fourth point, one noticed that the situation was becoming more and more catastrophic. 50% of the local population was infected with the virus. So you can imagine how many tourists also got infected. But fourth of all of this led to catastrophic management. I think most of you know, the first warning occurred on March 5th. And then the quarantine rules were only implemented on March 13th. And this led to most tourists leaving Ischgl from one day to the next. And the authorities intended to have the contact data of all holiday makers so that they can get in touch with Swiss and German authorities. Somebody is coming home now who might be infected. But collecting this data only started 3 hours after which communication had been spread that quarantine was to take place. So holidaymakers immediately left back to the other countries within those 3 hours and spread the virus, and nobody knows who these holidaymakers are. And the local authorities therefore could not warn the authorities in the European partner countries. These were the 4 mistakes that occurred from my viewpoint. And we can, of course, talk about these 4 in more detail in the course of our discussion. Should you have any other questions apart from that, thanks again for the invitation, and I look forward to the further interventions.
Thank you, Jakob. Allow me maybe to step in with a timeline. Just you feel free to kind of add things just so our viewers have a better overview of what happened and can place what you say into the time frame of the events in Ischgl. So as you already said, you mentioned the first warnings that were given to Austria in the case of Ischgl, where the first infections were noticed. If I'm not mistaken, that was on the 4th of March. So we are at the beginning of March, and the first warning comes to the system or to the European system, about which we are going to talk later to explain how that works. that, well, there were tourists from Iceland, they were in Ischgl and they were infected. The day after, the 5th of March, Iceland declared Ischgl a high-risk area. So we're at the beginning of March, and it becomes clear, at least for some countries, that, well, there might be a problem in Ischgl, in the ski resort where some tourists have caught the virus. A few days pass, the 7th of March, so 2 days later, there's the famous barkeeper in the Kitzloch bar, which is one of the after ski bars, very famous after ski bars, well, maybe no more famous now, in Ischgl, and a barkeeper there tested positive. I think 15 people in total who were in contact with him tested positive thereafter. And the bar was, you can step in, Jakob, if I do say something wrong, if you want to just add something. I think the bar was closed for a day and then it reopened with new staff. And then I think the 8th, 9th of March, there were more warnings through the European system to tell, well, from other member states or from other countries saying, well, we have a problem. There were tourists in Denmark and Norway who were infected, and we declare Ischgl a high-risk area as well, and do the same then Iceland. And then another 2 days later, on the 10th of March, the bars, the after bars and parties closed down, so there's no after ski, or in theory there's no after ski anymore, but the restaurant and hotels remain open. And then there's the 13th of March, which is kind of the day where there is a press conference by the Austrian Chancellor, Sebastian Kurz, declaring a quarantine in Ischgl, where I think the situation became quite chaotic. Can you just talk about that a bit more? And also if there's something that you need to add to the timeline, just, to have a broader overview, feel free to do so.
Das ist im Wesentlichen ein guter Abriss.
All in all, that's a good summary. You have clearly addressed the Kitzloch bar in Ischgl. And I think Professor Allerberger will explain clearly how overestimated the impact of Kitzloch is at some point, because the people from Iceland that you've mentioned that were tested positive in Iceland on the 4th of March, they were supposed to have infected, caught the virus in the plane, so they tried to cover this up, that this didn't happen in Ischgl, is what they said. And then they tried to limit it only to the Kitzloch, that this is not all of Ischgl, that is just this particular bar. And that all that they would need would be to change staff in this bar, and the whole area would be safe again. And the authorities have, from my point of view, completely underestimated that this virus had been spreading in Ischgl since February, end of February. And this, of course, means that other bars and hotels were affected. That was clearly not contained to the Kitzloch bar. And just to say a few words about the press conference on the 13th of March by Chancellor Sebastian Kurz, we do not quite clearly know how the communication was handled between the state government of Tyrol and the Austrian government in Vienna, who has pushed whom to talk about the Paznaun Valley, to decide that the Paznaun Valley would be in quarantine. But it was clear that shortly after noon, in this press conference, the Chancellor announced that this valley will be completely in quarantine. This valley, of course, contains Ischgl, and that means that all the tourists that were there just packed their suitcases and went home. The problem was that the police set up checkpoints, but only later. They did not have a legal basis to have controls. and there wasn't the paper form that people had to fill out upon leaving the country with how many people they were vacationing in Ischgl, where they were from, and contact data. That was all not ready when they announced quarantine. If that form had been ready, and if we had been able to send this to the other countries, that would have been very helpful. But the problem was that between the press conference and the moment the checkpoints were set up and were functioning, that took 3 hours. So we had 3 hours of tourists leaving Ischgl in a completely uncontrolled fashion, traveling home. And many of those may have been infected and weren't aware of it. That's at least what our numbers that we received from the other European states suggested. And they have been spreading the virus to a lot of different member states. So the first mistake here was that the quarantine was announced before the checkpoints were ready. First big mistake. Second big mistake, and the MEP mentioned it in his opening statement, that there are up to 20,000 people staying overnight every day in the Pasnan Valley. And these 20,000 people all had to leave on the 13th or 14th of March. And we had parliamentary inquiries, and through that instrument we found out that the authorities only collected 2,600 forms of leaving tourists. So you can quickly do the math yourself. How many people were not traced? How many people we did not have contact data for, where you couldn't contact local authorities in Germany, in Luxembourg, in other member states in general. And another thing that's as of yet unclear, but several journalists are looking into it, are researching this, and this is the last additional piece here I want to add, is the following question. People who were wanting to leave on 13th or 14th March of Ischgl had to fill out a form. I was in Ischgl, I haven't tested positive, and I will travel home immediately without interruption. And these forms should have been sent by the state government to the federal government, from the federal government to the European partners. What we do not know yet is these informations about tourists traveling home. At what point in time have they been transferred to the other member states, and have they been transferred at all? We do not know that yet. We're looking into it. The political opposition in Parliament, as well as journalists, are researching this question heavily. And I hope this was a clear and comprehensive overview for all of you. In case it wasn't, please feel free to ask questions.
Thank you. You already mentioned quite a lot of the questions that came up also in our brief introduction. So this is very helpful to kind of get an understanding of the situation. Maybe just one more follow-up question on the more European dimension of the events. You already mentioned quite a lot that there was a hiccup between how those forms that were supposed to be filled in when the tourists were leaving to kind of have this tracing and trace them back to their member states. Then there was the contact tracing already before the quarantine, where you said from your German tourist that you contacted who was positive, that didn't work very well. I remember that with some Icelandic tourists at the beginning of the pandemic, the problem was also that there were problems making this contact tracing work. So did you have any findings in your research about whether the problem was more a regional one? Did the regional authorities not get the necessary information to kind of do this contact tracing? Was it more on a national level that the competent authorities weren't aware of what was happening? Was it more in a European dimension that maybe the contact between the member states at that point didn't work very well? Did you have any sense of what actually, where was the kind of the problem?
Ich versuche mich kurz zu halten, aber ich habe
I'll try to be brief, but I have some impressions here I would like to share. So the first warning came from Iceland on the 4th and 5th of March, and this warning from Iceland was very detailed. So it was very vague. We have 8 positive tests of people that came back from Ischgl. This, of course, wasn't very helpful to local authorities, yet they didn't have the names, they didn't have the hotels they stayed in. That was the 4th. 1 day later, through the ministry in Vienna, questions had been asked, and at the 5th of March in the afternoon, we got feedback. So we have the names. So we had the 14 names of the infected and the hotels that they stayed in. And from my point of view, this would have been sufficient information for the local authorities to do contact tracing in the hotels that were concerned. So with which other tourists, with which staff members of those hotels were the infected in contact with. So that were there on that level, we had a regional problem that the contact tracing just didn't happen. They've asked questions in the hotels. Do you have staff members with symptoms? All the staff members said, we do not have any symptoms. That was it. So the coordination between the different authorities didn't really work that smoothly. I was under the impression that the Tyrol authorities would have liked to have more information from the Icelandic authorities. And instead, they didn't get this, so they contacted the tourists themselves. So the Tyrolian authorities always had to go through Vienna with their additional questions, and the ministry has, of course, with a little delay, forward these questions to Iceland that answer to Vienna, which then forward this information to Tyrol. So there was no direct exchange between the Tyrolean authorities and the Icelandic authorities, which may have helped, which may have been faster. That would be one quick impression where things could be improved, one aspect that could be done better, because you'd really have direct communication with the hotspot, with the place where the situation is happening.
Thank you. And maybe one last question. I mean, we know, or you have found out quite a lot on the irregularities. So how is this going to be followed up on an Austrian level? What is next in this investigation in Austria on a national level?
Darf ich da kurz nachfragen? Meinen Sie jetzt?
If I may, do you mean the political and judicial consequences, or do you mean legislative changes?
I meant the judicial consequences and political ones, so just to have a complete overview of the situation and then.
Ja, also in Österreich die Rechtsgrundlage ist.
So in Austria there is a pandemic law that is the legal basis for this, and this law foresees that in the case of such a disease you have to act quickly and contact tracing has to be done just to limit the spread of such a disease. COVID-19 is a disease that falls under this law, fulfills the characteristics, and now there is an inquiry going on by the state prosecution in Innsbruck. So there is directly against a political official, the Bezirkshauptmann, which is a head of a local administration that is active in this. Is not he's an official. He's not really an elected official. He's just a local official, and he has been accused. So there is an inquiry, or he is a suspect at least, as just like the community officials of Ischgl are being investigated. So all of the competent administrators for this. That's the first legal and judicial consequences. Nobody has been, there has been no verdict. Of course, everybody is presumed innocent, as is right and proper, but investigations are going on. And there are dozens of documents, tens of thousands of pages have been seized. All of their email communication has been seized. the quarantine orders, all of this is being examined, is being investigated to see if there is a suspicion to allow an actual trial or not. This is the first judicial consequences. On the political level, there's a lot that still needs to be cleared up. And if you look at the different parties, NEOS, SPÖ, that they are launching parliamentary inquiries to get answers from the government. So this is what's happening on political levels. The opposition is launching parliamentary inquiries, and then there's on a third level happening where those that suffered the consequences from this are trying to go through civil rights law to sue and get damages. Now, I am not a lawyer, and I have no idea if these lawsuits can be successful or not, but the lawsuit was considered admissible, at very least, by the responsible judges. So there are 4 trials going on, including some German citizens that are trying to get compensation for damages, and we will see if that will be successful.
Thank you. And then my last question to you would be, from your perspective as a journalist, what would be your explanation for the kind of irregularities or delays that you have stated in, well, that you have explained to us? Do you think it's more a problem, a systemic problem, that just the systems that we have in place were maybe problematic, or is it more a political or economic problem that it was difficult? I mean, it is an important ski resort. There is a lot of money being made because it's a tourist location. Has that been more the core considerations? Or third reason, of course, that it's a new virus and it's difficult to know how such a virus actually, I mean, you know, how to react to it, because we haven't had a situation like that before.
Ja, ich meine, Ihre Frage ist eigentlich auch schon die Antwort. Ja.
The question in itself is a very good one, but there's not a single factor that has led to Ischgl becoming the ground zero in Europe. There are many different factors, including factors that we do not know yet. One of them being that Ischgl was affected at a very early time. The authorities didn't quite know how to handle the situation yet. Contact tracing wasn't well practiced yet. So it is hard to blame them for it. But it is worth mentioning that within the correspondence between the authorities, just to give you an impression of the power relations in Ischgl, I called the mayor's office and said I'd like to speak to the mayor. And they then asked me to call the tourism association and said, who wants to speak with the mayor needs to call the press department of the tourist association. That really shows what the power relations are like in Ischgl. Tourism dominates affairs. And of course, the tourism industry had a vested interest in making it look like the risks aren't as serious as they might have been. So that would be my impression. And then thirdly, the different levels of authority, the cooperation between Tyrol and Vienna, but also between Tyrol and the European partners. The cooperation there didn't work particularly well. And the authorities from Tyrol are saying that they had insufficient information from the European partners to conduct contact tracing. For me, that's hard to examine. Seems like it's a defense reaction, but that is what the authorities say, that they would have required more information, that they would have liked to have spoken directly with affected people from Iceland and Germany. And this contact creation seems to not have worked. Surely that could be a topic that might also be of interest for the European Parliament.
Thank you so much for those explanations, and I think there's a lot of material that we can actually address with our people in the second panel on a more European dimension. Let's talk a bit about the scientific point of view. Dorothee von Leer, you work at the Medical University in Innsbruck, and your study on antibodies in Ischgl has been widely quoted in the press. You've found that over 40% of the local population in Ischgl had antibodies against COVID-19. Can you tell us a bit more about your study and also give us some explanations of this high percentage?
So, as the Medical University and Virological Department in Tyrol, we of course felt responsible to scientifically investigate the situation there. And of course, the official preparation, always with all the permissions you need for such a study, took a little bit, but in the end of April, we did a cross-sectional study of the inhabitants in Ischgl. So those that lived there, of course, we assumed that the population living now in Ischgl was representative for the what happened throughout the outbreak there. And we started on April 21st, and for 6 days, the people in Ischgl all came to the center and had their blood drawn for antibodies and had a throat swab taken. 80% participated of the total population, which was really surprising, with 1,473 people coming to be tested. And this was really, I must really say, I can't say anything about policy, I'm a scientist, but at that time point, there was a great interest in the authorities and in the people in Ischgl to find out exactly what happened. We also could include 214 children, which was also a high number at that time for such a study, which then we thought was pretty close to being representative. We took a throat swab from each one and did PCR. Positive PCRs were reproduced. And we did a very careful antibody testing, not only using one antibody, because most of you might have heard that antibody tests tend to produce at a low level, but significantly false positive results. And so we did 2 antibody tests and a confirmatory neutralizing antibody test, which is considered the gold standard. And the results of these were then used to calculate the seroprevalence. All this was accompanied by mathematical modeling by a group in Braunschweig, by Hermann, who's a pretty famous group in mathematical modeling of biological and epidemiological happenings. So we were then quite surprised to find that actually 42.4% had antibodies. For the adults, it was even higher, 45%, and for the children, it was lower, 27%. And actually interesting was that of the seropositive individuals, only 84 said they had been diagnosed with SARS-CoV-2. One reason was because many were asymptomatic, but another reason was because, sorry, there's a dog out there. Does that disturb much? Should I try to eliminate the dog, or is it okay?
Maybe not eliminate, but if you
eliminate from near my door. Okay. So I hope this is now better. Sorry. the reason actually, which was interesting maybe, was most of the people had not been diagnosed because they were not able to get a test at that time. It was not really our problem because we had much higher capacities in testing. Then we got tests for analysis, then we got samples to test. So actually there was a bit shortcoming in collecting the samples at that time for PCR, and many people went undiagnosed, especially during the whole of March. It became much better in April then. Generally, the clinical course was mild. At that time, it seemed surprising, but now other more comprehensive studies have confirmed the relatively lower infection fatality rate than one thought in the beginning, where one just calculated it from the number of reported cases. If you look at all people that somehow must have had the virus infection in March and April, it was actually only 2 elderly people that had died, and only 8 individuals had to be hospitalized. Interestingly, only 8 individuals were newly PCR positive in end of April, while a public screening at the beginning of April had found 20% being positive. The 8 individuals were 0.5%. So we had like a 40-fold drop in the prevalence of PCR positive individuals, which we thought may be due to a rising herd immunity in this region. Actually, to answer this question, we did mathematical modeling, in which we derived the percentage for herd immunity from the R factor, from the reproductive number. And from the reproductive number that was present in early March, herd immunity was not reached. However, of course, the reproductive number at the end of April was much lower because people were starting to wear masks. They had social distancing, etc., etc. So the R was probably lower. So what we concluded is that these non-pharmacological interventions in place, keeping the corona rules up in the village, had dropped the threshold for herd immunity that far that with 42% potentially there was a herd immunity under these non-pharmaceutical interventions. Of course, not if everything opens up again and après-ski bars are open again. And in addition, it's very interesting because the effect is, which we saw with this drastic decline of newly infected individuals, we thought that potentially also the issue that has now come up, that T-cell immunity can be present, at least at a low level, even in individuals that do not have antibodies. And this made us think that potentially the number of people that had been infected may have even been higher, but they just had they just developed a T-cell response and no antibody response. To look at this, we will have a follow-up study in the early November, the first week of November, where we will try to see if the antibodies are still there. We will look at T-cell responses, especially in those individuals which were highly exposed in families but did not become infected themselves. And I think this will be a very interesting follow-up. Just 2 or 3 general remarks at the end. So actually the decline we saw of reported symptoms was already between the 13th and 15th of March. People reported that after this time, but less people reported to have been ill in Ischgl from respiratory symptoms, loss of taste and smell. We asked for specific symptoms. And this would be a slight indication that indeed the closing of, not all, but of many of the après-ski bars already had a certain effect on the epidemiologic activity there. And maybe just to give it a dimension, it's not only that the tourists in Ischgl go to the to these bars. Actually, buses from almost all of Tyrol go there every evening in the winter to party there. So there's a big bus parking lot where the buses are standing from most of Tyrol, other touristic places, and from Ischgl and from Innsbruck to go to Ischgl to party in the winter. So it's not only for the Ischgl tourists, this après-ski life. That may also be a reason why it was focused so much in Ischgl, this activity, because most other ski resorts have the parties only with the tourists there in the ski village itself. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer. And but don't ask me about policy. I was not involved in the policy in Tyrol, and I was not asked for anything. So I had no influence on what was going on, except for the testing. You can ask me on that. Yeah.
Thank you already for this overview. Yeah, I have a couple of follow-up questions. So maybe to add or to build on what you said at the end, that when the bars were closing, you already saw that the infection went down. So if you could give us an overview of the curve of the virus in total, can you say that in the beginning it spread quite widely, and when the first measures were taken, it stopped spreading that much? So from a scientific point of view, is that a bit what happened? And then would you conclude then what measures should be taken in such a context? Is it enough to then close bars? Was that enough, or is a quarantine still the best solution in your view? I'm sorry, I think your microphone has been off. Can you please turn on your microphone? I'm sorry. I think now it works again.
Yeah, now it works again, but I'm going to try to share my screen again. Somehow.
It's just because we lost you, we lost the sound of you.
Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
So above you see the reported PCRs from the region, and as you can see, it's very difficult to see because the total red bar and blue bar shows the total number of tests performed, and you can see this is not very regular, the tests that were performed, but we have the reported specific symptoms which highly correlate with PCR positivity and antibody positivity, especially the loss of taste and smell. And we can see here that actually the peak is on the 14th. And as the peak always is delayed after a measure has been taken, Professor Allerberg can probably say more intelligent things about this, but we would have expected that the peak would drop after quarantine was implemented, and that would have been around the 20th. And around the 20th, already the activity in the Ischgl population had dropped significantly, but the drop started much earlier. This could be an artifact because memory of people may not be optimal, but I'm just trying to point out that at least we have not strong, but we have an indication that closing of the après-ski bars, which immediately stopped, of course, the buses coming in the evening, had already had an effect. Potentially, of course, it was known around the 10th to the population that that there was something going on in Ischgl. It was very clear potentially that people in Ischgl also behaved more carefully after that, so that the decline was a week after or 4 or 5 days after they became aware in the population. But within the Ischgl people, the drop was very early, which could indicate that there was something like a effect of closing the ski bars. But of course, this is not a very strong indication. Okay, did I answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thank you. And then maybe a follow-up on that, because that's something that might be relevant now. The flu season is starting. I mean, you said that a lot of people were infected, but that it was quite mild. Was that in general, or was that mostly for the local population that you tested? And then the next question being, I mean, it was in winter, so I guess it was where the flu and cold season was ongoing. So was that maybe something that also had an effect, given that people felt maybe sickish or a bit ill? But since there's also other flus and colds going around, that kind of dilutes the whole situation. Is that something that we have to prepare for also now, while this kind of cold and flu season is soon starting again?
Yes, this is a very good question. We looked at the correlation between reported symptoms and antibody positivity. And for those symptoms reported in early February, there was no correlation. So most of these symptoms were most likely flu-like symptoms. And actually already from the 22nd of March, this association with antibody positivity with reported symptoms became significant, clearly significant. So that's why actually in the end, the modeling was performed after the 22nd of March. But for the next season, I think all the virology laboratories are prepared or are preparing to perform actually PCRs that detect the 3 most important respiratory viruses that can cause severe disease, which is influenza, RSV, and coronavirus, SARS coronavirus 2. So these, I think that will be what we will do as soon as influenza comes, to test everybody that has a respiratory symptoms with a combination test.
Okay, and the fact that a lot of people had only those mild symptoms, is that something that was, well, more common to the mutation maybe of the virus in Ischgl, or is that really something that rather comes from the immunity or the kind of way the immune systems of the people infected reacted to the virus?
Well, one thing is clear, this virus was sequenced, the viruses from the Ischgl people, which we had preserved in our lab. The swabs were sequenced, and this is also under review, will be published soon. And here actually there is no indication that the virus specifically in Ischgl was less pathogenic than other virus strains around the world. Actually, there's hardly any indication that there's a significant variation in the pathogen virulence of different viruses around the world. The coronaviruses are pretty preserved, not like influenza or so. So, but of course, we asked the question whether there's something special about Ischgl or about the population in the mountains, you know, strong mountain selected people there. But if you look more and more into the publications now, that like we also did comprehensive analysis of populations where you look at everybody that was infected, not only those cases you diagnosed because they're ill, then you see that these asymptomatic and mild courses are, at least in the younger populations, quite common. Only the older people are more in danger, as now I think has become clear. So I don't know if Ischgl is really an outlier. The numbers are not really high enough to say this, but it is low. We had the idea about UV and vitamin D or something like that. The vitamin D levels in the Ischgl population does not differ from the same population which lives in the valley. We are now together with the NIH looking at genome-wide association. We're doing a genome-wide association study to see if there's any genetics things that the mountain population has been selected to be as very good against infectious disease. I mean, before tourism came, Ischgl was a very poor mountain village in Tyrol, with only the tourism has made it now to a nice and easy living place. Before that, it was high and not very comfortable to live there. So we do not have an answer to make it short. We do not have a clear answer, but we can exclude the virus variability, and we can exclude UV and vitamin D levels.
Okay, thank you so much. Maybe one last follow-up question. Could you say, I don't know if you have looked particularly at this, but could you say something about the effect of all the tourists that have been there, they caught the infection and then they left to the member states? Like from your scientific point of view, was that, how high was the risk there, and what was the situation like from your point of view at that point?
So from our study, most of the Ischgl population was already infected when the tourists left. So if we can calculate that maybe at that time 25 to 30% from the modeling of the Ischgl population was infected, there's no reason to assume that this was different among the tourists that left. And many never found it out because they didn't have symptoms, or they didn't get a test because there was not enough tests around and where they went. So I think that may have been a very significant spread, maybe larger than what we can see from the data we have. I don't think there's a reason to assume that the tourists were less affected than the population in Ischgl in the middle of April when they left.
Thank you so much for those explanations. I'd say that from there we can actually go to look at an example of the tourists leaving and build on that. So Nadi Chaudhry, you have been conducting a study in the Kiel Institute for World Economy, where you looked at how the virus spread to Germany, and you called Ischgl in your study, and that was, I think, caught on fire on the media, the ground zero for the propagation of the virus in Germany in general. Can you explain a bit what your study was about and how you came to that conclusion?
Okay, thank you, Charlotte, and to all the organizers for having me on board this discussion. Indeed, I think this paper follows really well from the previous interventions where we discussed how from Ischgl the virus is then transmitted across Germany. So our main aim in this paper was to investigate the regional disparities in the spread of infections in Germany. So for instance, it was clear quite at the beginning that the two southernmost states, Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg, were amongst the most affected. And even within these states, really at the county level, there was a lot of variation in both the number of cases and as well as the fatalities. And our objective was to try and explain why there was so much regional difference in the impact of COVID. What was also interesting to us when we started this paper was that these differences between regions were quite persistent over time. That is to say, we continued to observe that there was substantial dispersion in the extent to which these counties were affected, and that persistence and that difference kind of remained over time. So this paper tries to explain this spatial aspect of COVID-19 spread within Germany. And in particular, we explore whether tourists, German tourists that had been visiting super spreader locations, in particular the resort town of Ischgl, brought home the virus with them when they were coming back from trips in February and in March. So this was a hypothesis that was supported by the journalists at the time and was also being reported by state authorities. For example, I think by March 20th or so, 1/3 of all cases in Denmark and about 1/6 of those in Sweden had been traced back to Ischgl. So we were aware of this hypothesis from state reports and from journalists, but we really wanted to kind of investigate it empirically with data from Germany. So what we also wanted to do beside that was compare Ischgl's role as a hotspot in the spread of infections in Germany to other hotspots that had also emerged. So, for example, there was a mass church gathering in Mulhouse in the Grand Est region in France. And also there was carnival celebrations in Heinsberg in North Rhine-Westphalia. And we wanted to see kind of which of these hotspots were the most critical in the spread of COVID within Germany. To just briefly describe the methodology, and of course we can go into further details if there are questions here, but we use data on COVID-19 cases and morbidities that is provided by the Robert Koch Institute. And this is really at the county level. And our analysis was conducted for the period spanning March to mid-June. So we're essentially focusing on the kind of COVID through Germany. And with these data, we compute what is known as distance elasticities in the literature. And what these elasticities tell us is that what is the percentage increase in the cases or fatalities of a county when the road distance of that county to a particular hotspot reduces by 1%. So just to give a more simple explanation, the more important is the hotspot for spreading the virus, the greater the caseload for geographically closer counties, and therefore the higher will be that distance elasticity in absolute terms. So as we go farther away in space from the hotspot, the infection load will decay over space. So this is the kind of analysis that we tried to do in our paper. Now to get to the heart, the findings of the study, we see that Ischgl played a major role in the spread. We calculate that a 1% reduction in the road distance of a county to Ischgl corresponds to a 0.8% increase in the number of confirmed cases in that county. So this effect is quite substantial, and we want to have a cautious reading of this finding. So it's not causal, but there's a strong empirical link between road distance to Ischgl and the case counts. So we find that this effect is actually on top of other factors that could drive infections in a county. So after we take into account, for instance, the county's testing capacity or the population density or the demographic structure of the population, climatic conditions, etc. So these factors, these socioeconomic and geographic factors are also important for the spread of infections, but the effect from Ischgl is actually on top of these factors. So after we already control for these characteristics of the county. So this was a very striking finding for us. To frame it in another way, we looked at a hypothetical scenario and we calculated what the case counts would have been in Germany if all German counties had been as far from Ischgl as the most distant county. The county of Vorpommern-Rügen, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, is the most farthest county in Germany from Ischgl. So if all counties had been that far away, would cases in Germany have been lower? And we find that actually the caseload in Germany would have been reduced by half had the distance been the same as Vorpommern-Rügen. So clearly, Ischgl was an important predictor or driver of infections through Germany. That led us to also compare it with other hotspots to really examine if it was standing out in that respect as a super spreader location. And so we see the proximity of a county to Mulhouse as well as the proximity to Heinsberg, and compare if the effect of that proximity was stronger or weaker as compared to Ischgl. And we find that actually Ischgl is far more important in the geographical spread of infections than the other two hotspots. And maybe there are lots of policy variables or other factors behind the spread, but at least statistically, this is what we observe. And there's a lot to be investigated why that is the case. But we don't go into that issue in the paper yet. Finally, if we come to the fatalities from COVID-19, we see that while Ischgl, proximity to Ischgl affected the infection rates, it did not really determine the medical severity of those cases, and therefore it did not drive the fatalities in counties. So if you look at the case fatality rate, that was rather dependent on the county's age structure. So for example, the share of the population that was older than 65 years of age, so more in the vulnerable or risk category for COVID, and also dependent on the county's healthcare infrastructure. So for instance, the number of hospital beds. And actually on this last point, we find that a 10% increase in the number of beds in a county actually reduced deaths by approximately 1.2%. So clearly access to quality medical care is imperative for minimizing the loss of human life from the pandemic. And finally, we examined the Ischgl effect over time. So we find that this distance to Ischgl factor does not become irrelevant as the pandemic progresses. It kind of suggests that the lockdown measures in Germany have been more effective because once they reduced mobility, the infections, the distribution of infections over space kind of remained the same as in the beginning. So we didn't have further diffusion across German counties had there been complete mobility. So we find that this distance to Ischgl continues to matter even over time. Just to wrap up, I think I would say some thoughts on the mechanisms by which infections can spread in an economy and which particular mechanism we focus on. So our analysis is really looking at the role of international tourism and the spread of virus through travelers to a hotspot. But there can be other channels through which infections can spread. For example, we could have regional disparity in the infections and mortalities because of their exposure to or their reliance on trade with foreign partners or foreign countries that are also experiencing a peak in COVID cases. So for instance, because the outbreak was first reported in China, we examined whether infections were higher in counties that traded more with China. The kind of hypothesis behind that was whether more economic ties with China would lead to more mobility of persons with China across, through business networks, etc. And if that was a possible channel, which generated the spatial differences in COVID within Germany. And we find that, at least in Germany, the transmission across counties was not significantly related to the strength of trade relations or the economic ties with China. So that was, I think, also something valuable that our study contributed. And finally, another channel could be the role of migration. So we also check if migration could explain the differences in the infection rates between counties. So for instance, if migrants traveling back from home or traveling to home had become infected over the course of their journeys, if that was a factor. And here too, we don't see any statistically significant relationship between a county's share of foreign residents in the overall population and the incidence rate of cases. So it appears, at least from this first wave of data, that Ischgl, rather than trade relationships or migration, was an important driver of infections through Germany. And I think I will wrap up there, but I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Thank you so much for this very exhaustive overview. We borrowed, I think, from your study, the term that we use also in the title of this event, the one of super spreader locations. So I just wondered, you mentioned Minhus besides Ischgl, for example. How would you qualify such a location? And with view of the virus is still there, we don't have any constant remedy yet, hopefully yet. What do we need to look out for in order to prevent such a scenario based on your findings now?
Oh, that's a very big question. So I think what is common amongst super spreader locations or super spreader events is that high density of people traveling from multiple areas. So the acceleration is then amplified once people leave that event or leave that location and disperse geographically across a wide space. This is true for Ischgl, but it was also true for English football, that there's another study that examines the spread of cases through England because of a big football match. It's also the case for basketball matches that had been organized in the US and also led to an explosion of cases in the surrounding areas. So it's a matter of a high density population, like meeting together and then dispersing across a wide area.
Thank you so much. That leaves us a couple of minutes for some closing remarks for our three first panelists. So maybe starting with you, Jakob. Do you have any additional thoughts on that? And also maybe do those scientific findings that we've heard of now and that are very, very, very interesting, do they fit what you investigated in your articles and in your work?
Auf jeden Fall, ich sehe da keinen Widerspruch, jetzt insbesondere die
Definitely, there's no contradiction here, especially the last explanations clearly showed how the infected people traveled across the whole of Europe, especially in Germany. I thought of one further lesson that we could draw from the events in Ischgl. I have the following impression. The German Robert Koch Institute has been alluded to. And regions in Germany were also declared as risk areas by the Institute. And the question is, why was Ischgl considered a risk area by Iceland on the 5th of March, by Norway on the 8th of March, by different European countries, but they all had a different assessment of the area. So this is a question that might have to be discussed at a political level. Why did one not manage to coordinate more at a European level as to the coordination, as to the definition of crisis areas? I still have questions about this. I also do not know if it makes sense for all to have the same risk zone definition, but there seem to be different interpretations in different EU states. So I do wonder whether it makes sense for each and every country to have its own opinion. The Icelanders were clearly on the right track. And if the European partners had taken Iceland more seriously and defined Ischgl as a risk area, then this hotspot could have much earlier been assessed as such. So my question to politicians would be whether it wouldn't make sense to have more uniform definitions of risk areas within the European Union.
Thank you, Jakob. Dorothy von Leer, do you have any closing remarks that you want to share with us?
No, not really. I mean, I think scientifically we can't.
Oh,
thing that happened. It's just not documented well enough, the cases in the beginning of March, so that we can really know what the whole population and the effect in Europe really was. It's all speculation in the end. Okay, you hear me?
Now it works. We lost you in between. There was some disturbances with the sound.
Yeah, I just want to point to the fact that all this is, of course, extrapolations from things we looked at afterwards. And these are not hard numbers we're presenting, they're from modeling, etc. So the real extent of the impact of the Ischgl outbreak, I think now cannot really be, we made very, very 100%, we do not know what really happened. It's always speculation and predictions from.
I'm sorry, Ms. von Laar, we're losing you. The sound is very bad, but if I can sum up, I hope I sum up well what you wanted to say, that basically the results are quite tentative and that we are always...
My internet is obviously not good anymore, yeah? So that's what I'm trying to say. It's pretty... Yep.
No, I think we're losing you. But as I said, I'm summing up for you that's well, what you outlined is that the results are always tentative and that we're always dealing with speculations. And of course, we're shedding a look back, which is always easier than dealing with a situation when it arises. I hope I do sum up that kind of in the way you wanted to say it. Sonali, do you have any closing remarks?
One final impression is how critical a role time plays in this spread. So really, if we want to limit the transmission paths and control the cross-border spill, then we have to really act fast. And the contact tracing issue that Jacob mentioned before is also crucial. Of course, this all presents a big challenge to the tourism industry that is a very important employer in many regions. So a lot of policy solutions and innovative ideas need to come forward about how to preserve our tourism industry and also preserve the employment that it generates in many tourism-dependent areas, while also ensuring safety of tourists.
I'm sorry, I was muted. So thank you so much for this panel and this very interesting first discussion. To sum up, I would say we have learned that there were some delays and irregularities in the response to and the management of COVID-19 in Ischgl, and that's, well, that there has been the event where tourists brought the virus back home to all over Europe and to many countries, which of course was one of the reasons why the virus spread from there. So on the other hand, we can say that on a European level, we have some tools and institutions that help us deal with, in general, with cross-border health threats and that are specifically set up to do that. And COVID being one of those threats, if not the most important one that we have faced so far. So the question also arises, and some questions of that or some issues we already have discussed or have been raised in the first panel are how well do the mechanisms that we have actually work? And that's what we're going to discuss in our second panels, where we're more looking at how can we manage such super spreaders as Ischgl, but also others. With us is Dr. Andrea Amon. She's the director of the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control. And of course, as such, he has been very closely involved in the response to the pandemic that has been hitting us for months now. Then also with us is John Ryan. He's the European Commission's Director for Public Health, and as well has been very closely involved in managing COVID-19 in the EU. From Austria, Dr. Allerberger is joining us from the Public Health Division of the Austrian Agency for Food and Health Safety, the AGES. And then from Luxembourg, Dr. Claude Müller is joining us. He's a virologist. He's been examining viruses for many, many years, mostly in a non-European context, but of course now he's very closely involved in the management of the virus on our national level in Europe. So maybe let's start with a question to all of you. Could we have foreseen a scenario like Ischgl and the consequences thereof? Maybe we start with Dr. Müller. You just have to unmute your microphone first, so we can hear you.
Yeah.
Now it works.
Okay, thank you very much, Charlotte. I think it's important to understand what has happened in Ischgl, and we had some insights, but I think looking at it from a more global perspective, I've been involved in outbreak control and virus surveillance on 3 or 4 continents since many years, and I'm also monitoring outbreak preparedness as member of the WHO Regional Verification Committee of the Middle East and Northern African region. And I must say that the situation, the way it has just been described, is exactly what happened in other countries. So I think sometimes it's a little bit more sophisticated, sometimes it's not. But I think it starts with the situation that nobody really likes to cry wolf and be ridiculous, because people rather say, well, I want to be careful, I want to hide behind others' responsibilities. So that's one first thing. So don't exaggerate, or it will not be as bad as you think. So then the first reaction will be that people who are not familiar with the outbreak, they will simply ignore it or silent others that talk about it. And I've seen this for the H5N1 in Africa. I've seen it in various countries in Africa. You find different ways of silencing people. And I think we have had some examples in Wuhan too, where it's simply, you say it has to be knowledge-based, and then it takes 5 days for tests to be done. And so you have gained time, and if you're lucky, the PCR will be negative because the sample has been too hot, and then so forth. And or you want to test in a central lab again, and so forth. So there are reasons and ways to do this. Then once you have the evidence, you have the reaction is slow and half-hearted, and you do not really want to use the big tools, the big guns. Then the next reaction is that you want to silence the messenger. And I think we had some accounts of this also here in Ischgl. You don't want to hear, and you try to attack those who actually point the fingers. Then the next thing, and I've seen this actually in very dramatic ways in Africa, where people were just displaced, moved to other regions because they talk about H5N1 or other outbreaks. So you shoot the messenger. Then the next stage is that now that it becomes obvious that the virus is everywhere, everyone becomes a virologist. Those who have never had any contact with viruses before all of a sudden become virologists. So you have these 3-week-old virologists who know how to do things, and the virologists are those who have the power, and they're not the ones who have the knowledge. So that's another problem. And we had this situation again in Africa, we had it in Luxembourg, we had it in Asia, we had it in other places too. And then finally, when everything becomes obvious, you try to control communication, at least as much as you control the virus. And so you want to be the one who tells, what the situation of the virus is. And so you are in control, perhaps not of the virus, but you're in control of what people know about the virus. And so if we go through these different stages, then I think we understand better where we have to start talking about, how to handle such a situation. But now I think, anyone who raises his finger and says, well, do you remember what happened after, with SARS-2 or the latest coronavirus, then everybody will, of course, be much more reactive. So hopefully the experience of COVID-19 now has changed or has trickled down to every single person and understands that this is what can really happen. It has happened now, and in the future it can happen again. So I think that's a very important point, something that we have learned because now we can think the unthinkable, what we couldn't do before.
Thank you. Maybe you, Ms. Amon, did you foresee, I mean, your agency is responsible for evaluating such threats as COVID was, or is rather. Did you foresee any scenario like that, or did Ischgl and other super spreaders such as Mulhouse and the other events, did that come as a surprise, or was it something that you were prepared for?
I think we have to pull ourselves back in time. We had a situation where at the time when end of February, or let's say mid-February, we had the example in China where these drastic measures have been implemented. And I can tell you, beginning of February, I was told by various people, that was the time I still could travel to Brussels. And I had my hearing in the European Parliament at that day, at the first week in February. So many people told me, look, these measures are feasible in China, but in Europe, it would not be possible. And that is what Claude also said, exactly reflecting this mindset, saying, well, we have never done this, and it has so severe consequences. So we cannot do this at this stage. Beginning of February, Europe had maybe 20, 30 cases, all Europe. But then I think, and we have to look at this in what is not only for Ischgl, because it was not only Ischgl actually, where infected people came back from skiing holidays. Ischgl had just a bigger size. Because the other places may have been too small to really create a hotspot, but we had definitely reported infections from a large variety of skiing resorts in Italy, in Austria, to a lesser degree in France and Switzerland. So, and what was happening end of February was the massive outbreak in northern Italy. So everybody was actually also focusing on what's happening in Italy. And so we have published guidelines on non-pharmaceutical interventions on 10th of February. Where, of course, all these measures that have eventually were taken were described. But as I said, and as Claude Müller also very, very well described, there was this thinking, we cannot do this. We have never done this. And what if it isn't that bad? So I also think now we know how bad it can get. And we see also that these measures are now put in much more readily than before. And they are recognized to have an effect of reducing the transmission. So that is, I think, now what we have really learned. In addition, at that time, it was also very apparent that the laboratory material testing kits were scarce. So also the testing was not comparable to what we are doing right now, what the countries are doing right now. So it also from that end, it was not helping rapid recognition and to actually assess the spread.
Thank you. Maybe the Austrian perspective on that, Dr. Allerberger, were you, I mean, you had to handle this case and others from the front line, I would say, with your agency. Were you prepared? Did you expect that with the ski season, maybe something like this could have happened?
To me, I think this whole epidemic or pandemic is also a success story, because if we would have a similar event 10 years, 20 years ago, we wouldn't have maybe not even recognized it. The virus itself was described on January 12th, the sequences. And at the end of January, we already had the diagnostic capacity in Vienna. The Institute of Biology and AGES set up the diagnostic system within a few days. So Christian Drosten, once again, has to be mentioned. This is a huge success. If I think back at HIV, it took us years until we had a diagnostic tool. So just comparing it with previous real outbreaks, large pandemics, I think we also benefited from the joining the European Union, because in 1995, Austria had the obligation to set up investigation of foodborne outbreaks. And Andrea Ammon is hosting the EPIET UFEM training programs. And for foodborne outbreaks, this actually prepared a country like Austria, because up to then, we only had the epidemic law. And the epidemic law, and this is part of the problem, because this is based on 94 individual districts. And this doesn't allow outbreak investigation. If it comes to foodborne outbreaks, we created a separate law, the zoonosis law, where it's clear if it's district, yes, the district is responsible. If it's more than one district, the province, and if it's more than one province, the district. Last year, we had a huge measles outbreak in Austria. People from America, States, and Ukraine got infected. And with a huge discussion in the ministry, whether or not we are allowed to investigate the ability of the individual head of the district. So this was part of the problem, because when the warning came in from Iceland in March 4, it was not that clear who's in charge of taking the responsible actions. So for me, once again, the diagnostic part is a great success. The fact that the European Union prepared us for foodborne zoonosis is a huge success. If you look Google Allerberger and outbreak and listeria, you will find 2 large outbreaks in Germany, which were published. We are now allowed to publish it, and nobody is scared. But for this new disease, once again, the responsibility was not really clear. And I think the lesson is the European Union has not real mandate for coping with diseases as soon as they are not foodborne. I think this has to be clarified, because this was a problem. And the main problem, in my opinion, once again, we have to look back. WHO didn't do a good job, with all due respect. WHO, in the mid of January, they still claimed that it's not clear that this disease is human-to-human transmissible. On January 14, they stated this may be a disease which is not human-to-human transmissible. not before January 22nd, they recognized this is an infectious disease. The pandemic was declared on March 12th, which is a week after we had the problem in Ischgl. So the pandemic, and of course this was a pandemic, but WHO for some reason refused to declare the pandemic. So I think there are many, many reasons, and not talking about the warning that a post of WHO that drinking water has to be boiled before consumption and food has to be properly heated before consumption, which is stupid for COVID, or for claiming that ibuprofen and some antidiabetics and hypertension drugs are dangerous, increasing the risk. So WHO failed. ECDC, European Commission, did a good job, but once again, they are not in charge for infectious disease if it's not foodborne. I'm coming to the end. I think at this time, it was based on the problem that in Austria, for this kind of disease, we still have to rely on the epidemic law, and this giving the responsibility to an individual district doesn't work. In Ischgl, we had the problem that the head of the public health agency in the province of Tyrol stated, from a medical reason, it's highly unlikely that you can get infected in the après-ski bar, which is ludicrous. And claiming that the risk in airplanes is so high that all the Icelandic tourists got infected on their 4 different planes to Iceland is also ludicrous. To me, that's anticipating obedience, that's preemptory obedience. And Professor Müller mentioned it. We're in a lucky position because I still have my position, even if I state this is ludicrous. But at the end of the day, we have to make sure that risk assessment is separated from risk management, and risk assessment has to give a solid interpretation. And in Ischgl, once again, this was mainly due to the fact that the head of the public health department in Tyrol was not strong enough and declared that it's highly unlikely that someone gets infected in an après-ski discotheque. And this caused all this delay. And of course, the Icelandic people, they are foreigners, and the Norwegians are foreigners, and the Denmark people, they are foreigners, and nobody can be trusted. I think this is the lesson. At the end of the day, what we did for foodborne infections, I think should be translated for non-foodborne infections, and the responsibility should be clear. European institutions, head of the governments and province and district. And if Icelandic country states that there's a risk, then it would be the government who has the responsibility to check whether that's true or not. And this responsibility was given to the district physician in the Bad Naun, and this didn't work. That's my lesson. But at the end of the day, once again, the virus was described on January 12th, and at the end of January, we had the diagnostic capacity. This wouldn't have been possible years ago. So sharing information, making it freely available, not charging money for the PCR primer sequences, I think it's a success story at the end of.
Thank you so much for this intervention. I think you probably raised many, many issues that the others want to react to as well. Maybe let's start with John Ryan. First of all, how did you experience the situation when it was clear that the virus was going to be a European problem? And also, can you agree with what Mr. Allerberger said, or are there elements that maybe you want to clarify from the European perspective?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. And thank you as well to Charles Goerens for organizing the discussion. I think it would be useful for people online perhaps to know what the background of our responsibility is here at the European level. We have a legally binding system in place for cross-border health threats, which exists since 2013, and which sets up a system of surveillance, a sort of a statistical system of surveillance for communicable diseases. We also have a secure IT alert system, which allows the member states to communicate between each other regarding outbreaks of communicable diseases or other health threats, including unknown health threats. And we then asked the ECDC, the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control, to carry out independent risk assessments at the point that Dr. Allerberger just mentioned. So this is something that's done by the European Centre independently of the member states and independently of politics. And on the basis of that risk assessment, then we have a committee called the Health Security Committee, which meets at the moment every week, and which looks at the different aspects of the crisis and tries to coordinate a position. The big difference between our powers in the European Union in other areas and in the area of public health are that in many other areas there is a power of legislation and there's a power of obliging countries in the European Union to adopt a common position. In the area of communicable diseases and public health, generally speaking, we have a much weaker role, which is limited to coordination of measures. And therefore, I would say that one of the lessons learned, which we're trying to put together at the moment from this COVID event, is the looking at the possibilities to have a more tight regime and actually bringing the member states to a situation where they could accept to move in the same direction at the same time. We see the chaos that exists at the moment in the situation between the member states as regards borders. We see the different measures which are taken on a national level, which of course is normal given the different epidemiological situation in each member state. It's quite normal. But where the problem occurs is when one country's measures are not perhaps at the level they should be. Could be for very good reasons. It could be for reasons of national organization. For example, there might be regions which might not share the same approach. And we see an example in the south of Europe at the moment where the central government is asking a region to do something and the region is saying, no, we want to do our own thing. There are examples like this in many countries with a regional setup. And I think from the lessons learned, which I've heard this morning, this regional national interface is a very interesting one to look at. We've never looked at this, I must be quite honest, we've never looked at this at the European level. We have always interacted with the member state and not with the regions. The only exception I can think of is the joint procurement operation where we jointly buy medical countermeasures like vaccines and masks and things like that, where in some member states the regions are actually part of the contract procedure. So I think just summarizing, it's extremely useful that we're having this reflection today. I think we should not allow these events to just happen and then move on to the next event. I think it's really important that the facts of the case are established. It's also important, and I'd like to emphasize this, that there should be no finger pointing and no blaming. I think we should use these occasions as learning occasions, because that's the only way that people will be honest and will give their honest opinion and will be able to learn some lessons for the future. If you start immediately launching legal action and administrative inquiries and things like that, I think the tendency would be that people will try and protect their position. And therefore, I think it's really important when everybody is working to protect public health, or everybody should be working to protect public health, that we try and identify where things went wrong in a particular situation. And the situation in Austria that you have described this morning is not unique. We've had many such events around Europe, and many such events which, in retrospect, we would certainly deal with in a different way. But let's try and use this occasion to identify and study what happened and try and learn lessons. Thank you.
Thank you. One question that came up in the first panel this morning was also the question of the coordination, in the sense that, as Jakob Winter told us, there were some countries that decided to put Ischgl on the list of high-risk areas much earlier than others. The Robert Koch Institute, that's much quoted in that regard, only did that on the 13th of March, while other countries such as Denmark, Norway and Iceland already said so on the 8th of March or on the 9th of March. So is this kind of duplication of measures that are not in line between the member states or between one country to the next also something problematic? And maybe is that something where the ECDC, for example, could step in and just, I mean, the competence that you have, bring that in and kind of streamline those questions within, of course, the limits of your mandate? And maybe we can also talk about that limit.
You are asking me right now? Good, okay. No, but I mean, as John Ryan said, right now, this is out of the question that we can do something like this, because this is the prerogative of the member state. We have limitations or seen limitations to this distribution also in other areas, because right now, still, although all member states have really stepped up their testing, but the testing approaches are still different, and the number of tests per 100,000 population really range between a few hundred per 100,000 and several thousand tests per 100,000. So it's really a wide range. And this, of course, influences how many cases you detect. So just looking at the number of cases right now is a bit misleading if you don't consider these other parameters. I mean, the number of tests, the percentage of tests that is positive, the trend over time, and other factors like hospitalization and deaths as well. So it is not an easy task with the current setup, that there are so many different approaches as to who is tested. We have put forward testing criteria, testing strategies. I mean, who should be tested in the minimum situation, who should be tested at the optimum situation. But it is up to a country what they do. And that is what we are seeing right now. So asking us now to say, well, can you not just define levels where it's dangerous and where it's not dangerous to travel to, is hampered by that. The other thing what is hampering right now, has been all along, is the fact, is it really the fact that someone crosses a border that is what makes an infection risk, or is it what the person does in the country? I mean, if someone crosses from a higher incidence area to a lower incidence area, but is keeping the distance, washing the hands, putting on a face mask, I think this is less of a risk than someone that is coming from a low or medium size and is mingling with everybody as if nothing has happened. So I think we have to really emphasize, and I think now some countries are looking into this, what is it actually that caused the infection in people that have been tested positive after returning from another country. And what emerges right now is that it's mainly they participated in family gatherings, in bigger festivities, in celebrations, or just went to party. And that, I think, is what we have to get across. That it's not not so much the epidemiology at a situation where the virus is still almost everywhere in Europe, that causes an infection, but it's more what people do. So we have to try to really influence this behavior.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Mr. Allerberger, you want to react?
No, I'm completely agree. I think in Austria, this warning was even used in order to help the domestic industry, tourism industry, because people were advised to spend the vacation inside Austria. Now we see that we have the problem that Germany is warning for tourism in the western part of Austria, which highly relies on winter tourism. So I think we have to separate what was made for public health reason. Andrea Ammon completely said it correct, or what was made more for political reasons. But I would just like to mention once again, I think the whole event was handled quite well. And the fact that in Austria, the public health laboratory, and we are not supposed to do routine testing. We did 70,000 PCR tests so far, our public health institution, starting from 0 in January up to 70,000 now. And this test was implemented. Now we have some Abbott machines, but initially this Charité protocol was implemented by a UFEM fellow. A UFEM fellow financed by the European Union set up this test in Austria because the head of the institute was on sick leave, the head of the department was on Kilimanjaro climbing, and a simple young French lady from Institut Pasteur set up this test. So the European system of EPIET, UFEM, this really worked, and this is what we benefit from. What I accuse the European Union is they completely failed with the diagnostic tests. The Medical Devices Directive, I think should be in effect since 1993, completely failed. In Austria, we had diagnostic tests from China, which were fraud. They had the CE certificate. We asked Germany to give us the original because it didn't work. And it turned out the CE certificate for this China company was referring to the existence of a quality department and was issued in 2019, before the virus was available. So there are tests on the market which are fraud, and nobody is in charge. We informed German TÜV that the CE certificate is used in a criminal way. They say, not our business. We only certified that they have a quality department in China, and that's correct. And we see the same now with the antigen tests. They are widely used. We publish a paper in the European Journal Clinical Microbiology Infection and state that the sensitivity is 47%, which is fine, because the Italian colleagues say we find the highly infectious persons, 47%. If you find all those with a CT value in PCR less than 25, it's fine. But the company Roche is making huge advertisement and claims 95.6%. So between 47% and 95.6%, and nobody's in charge because it's the private company who has the CE certificate and all the authorities are laying back. I think for medical devices, we have a need to improve the situation because it can't be that fraud and criminal action, money making is uncontrolled.
I think Dr. Ryan, you wanted to react, and also Claude Müller shook his head and wants to say something. So let's start with Dr. Ryan, and then Claude Müller, you can come in next.
So 2 points, because I think it's of interest to citizens how the situation has arisen, that we have so many different measures, particularly as regards borders. Now, I take fully on board what Andrea Ammon has just said, that the advice of ECDC and the advice of WHO is that borders are not an appropriate place to stop a virus. That if you want to stop a virus, you have to do that across your territory and not expect that the customs officers are going to magically stop the transmission at the border. So that's our scientific advice, if you like, that the border controls don't sort out the problem of spread of transmission. However, traditionally speaking, and since most travel advice has been in relation to countries outside Europe, because of civil unrest or outbreaks of disease or whatever the reason might be. Therefore, the foreign ministries have been the ministries issuing this advice. And traditionally, even though there is a sort of a coordination within the Council of Ministers at European level, this is very much done in a soft way. The Commission, recognizing that these border controls are effectively undermining the internal market and free movement rights, has made two proposals for Council legal acts. One of them has been adopted already. It's a Council recommendation, which applies between the European Union and countries outside Europe. And there it establishes a green list of countries where travel is considered to be safer than travel with other countries, subject to all the reserves that I gave earlier on concerning the fact that border controls are not the best way to do things. But at least as regards countries outside Europe, the member states have agreed on a common position and a system for changing the list of countries. As regards internal border controls, the Commission has also proposed a Council recommendation, I think about 3 weeks ago. It's making very, very heavy weather in the Council. It's based on a text which was suggested by the Commission, but based on the data which we have. One of the problems we have is the lack of data for some of our member states, in particular at the regional level. How do you determine whether a country is green or red or blue or whatever the color is going to be, if the quality of the data is not there? And how do you interpret the data? As Andrea Amon said, you have to take account of the number of tests, the rate of infectivity, the number of hospital beds, and a number of other criteria which need to be put in the mix so that you have a complete picture. So that's where we are at the moment. I mean, we are moving gradually towards a situation where the member states, I think, will agree in the Council on a common methodology for making these decisions. But overall, the Commission continues to think that the border controls are really an unnecessary barrier to free circulation and are not justified for scientific reasons in terms of controlling the outbreak. As regards the point that was made by Dr. Allerberger concerning the medical devices legislation, all I can say is that in all of the discussions that I've participated in so far, whether it's between the member states or with the Council, I've not heard this problem of the application of the medical devices directive being targeted as a lesson learned. And I'm very grateful that he raised this problem. So I'll make sure that my colleagues follow up on this, because I think if we collect the number of cases of unsatisfactory medical devices, it would certainly be a good opportunity to look again at how the directive is worded and see if we can improve. Thank you.
Thank you. Claude Müller, I'm sorry, you've been waiting so long for a reaction, so go ahead.
That's all right. Okay, so I understand, of course, my colleagues, Andrea and John, who look at it from a European perspective, but I think there's also the country perspective. I think we need to, and the time perspective. So first of all, I think it was pretty clear when COVID came to Europe that the countries experienced different phases of the incoming virus. And they were in different phases at different times. And I think we need to take this into consideration. So I think when we had the situation in Italy, there was essentially no case, for instance, in this country or in Germany. We had the situation in Spain and in France, which was totally different than in some of the other, in the Eastern European countries, which closed down very quickly. By the way, also the African countries closed down extremely fast. So I think we need to take this time aspect and the phase aspect into consideration when we talk about the European borders. So there, I would say it was clear that borders were closed, and I think it was a way to protect, for the countries to protect themselves against high risk or high incidence countries. Now, the situation may become different when we are sort of at a cruising speed where we have similar numbers of cases in different countries. Now, but as Andrea said, how do we know that we have similar numbers of cases in different countries? And this is where the problem starts. So in principle, I'm totally with you about, you know, the principle. But Luxembourg has tested its whole population already, and we have our daily positivity rate is below 1 per mil. Other countries, they test and they have a positivity rate of 2, 3, 5%. So this is very clearly a totally different situation. And I think we need to take this into consideration. Second point is that if we think that it makes sense to make internal border controls, like in Germany, maybe the Land or the Kreis, or other countries, provinces, cantons, or whatever, then I think we need to also allow, you know, the bigger entities to close down. Now, that's not to say that I'm in favor of that, but it may be a necessity. And especially if countries have the feeling that you know, they are much better off than other countries in terms of numbers of cases, because they have a much higher hidden or asymptomatic number of cases which are not detected. We detect asymptomatic cases almost quantitatively. Other countries don't. So I think the sheer numbers, and Andrea, you said it, I'm totally with you, the sheer numbers of cases is not the right way of assessing. Now, of course, it would be the role of the EU to make sure that we have a uniform way of testing. But do we, as Luxembourg, want to revert to a system like in, well, I don't want to name any country, but do we want to revert to another system if we can afford to do what we are currently doing? Besides, our situation is a totally different one from a big country. I mean, we have 200,000, I mean, that's 50% of the workforce coming in and out of the country every single day. So, you know, the situation of the borders is totally different for different countries. What else? So I think we need to let the countries have some country-specific interventions. And I give you some examples of that. So I talked about the different phases, but I also want to mention the different living conditions. If we talk about Italy, we have easily 3 generations living under tight conditions on an apartment on the 5th floor, you know, on 50 square meters. We don't have that here in Luxembourg. So it's very clear that that home quarantine here in Luxembourg or other countries, you know, I don't want to emphasize Luxembourg too much, but home quarantine is different here than it is in other countries, such as Italy or Spain. So I think we need to make this different. Then the risk groups are also different. I mean, we have countries where the diabetes is very well monitored, and we have other countries where diabetes is less well monitored. And this also means that we have different levels of risk groups. So the risk groups are different. And then, yeah, I think that pretty much, what other did I have? I think that's pretty much covers it.
Thank you for those explanations. So I see that not everything can, if I can sum up well, can be decided on a European level, albeit some things need to. I have 2 quick questions to Dr. Allerberger because he has to leave us in a minute. Given on what we talked about in the earlier panel, and maybe there's something Dr. Ryan can also step in a bit, is those EWRS notifications that you also explained to us how they work. So my question being is, how in practice, I mean, we have the case of Ischgl as an example, there were the first notifications through this system, and the system has become important in our discussion earlier as well, because while the tourists were leaving Ischgl, the idea was also to have the tracing information on the system. In practice, or in the case of Ischgl, what did these notifications, I mean, how can I imagine how this looked like, and what